There is
Hold
something that
still now,
happens
son.
inside a
It
person when
stings
they
a
hear a
little.
child
I
crying
know.
in a
You're
place where
being
no
very
child
brave.
should be.
Thanks, Pa.
It does not matter who you are or where you come from. Something deep and old wakes up inside your chest and moves your legs before your mind even has a chance to argue about it. Most people call it instinct. Some call it conscience. In the frontier towns of the American Southwest, in the brutal stretch of high desert between the Rio Grande and the Colorado Plateau, men called it different things depending on the day. Samuel Thorne woke at 3 in the morning from the same dream he had been having for 22 years. In the dream, his wife Rebecca was lying in their bed in Pennsylvania, her skin burning with fever, her hand reaching for his across the quilted blanket. She was 7 months pregnant. The baby had never been born. Rebecca had never opened her eyes again after that last reach for his hand. In the dream, she always said the same thing. Her lips barely moved, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere far away, like an echo traveling across years instead of across a room. "Promise me," she would say. "If you ever hear a child crying, don't walk away. Promise me, Samuel." He had promised, God knows he had promised, but he had not been able to save her. He had not been able to save their child. And for 22 years, that failure had followed him like a shadow that grew longer instead of shorter as time passed. Samuel sat up in the darkness of his small ranch house, his breathing heavy, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cool desert night. The dream was always worse in the summer. He did not know what. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the way the land got so dry that it seemed to pull moisture from everything, even from memories that should have dried up and blown away a long time ago. He lit the oil lamp beside his bed and looked around the room. It was small and spare furnished with only what a man needed to sleep and wake and sleep again. A bed, a dresser, a chair with his clothes folded on it. On the dresser was a small wooden box. He did not open it often, but he knew what was inside. A lock of Rebecca's hair, their wedding photograph, and a small knitted sweater she had made for the baby blue wool, with tiny white buttons never worn. Samuel was 54 years old. He had been ranching in the Sonoran borderlands of Arizona Territory for 18 years. Before that, he had fought in the war between the states as a Union soldier. He did not talk about the war. He did not talk about Pennsylvania. He did not talk about Rebecca. He had come west with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and the particular kind of stubbornness that some men mistake for courage. He had bought 40 acres of land that nobody else wanted, coaxed water from ground that everybody else said was too dry, and built a working cattle operation, one fence post in one season at a time. But there were things he had not built. He had not built friendships. He had not built trust. He had not built a life that felt like anything more than penance, a slow and steady paying back of debts he could never fully settle. The war had given him plenty of those debts. There had been a boy in Virginia, a black child maybe 8 years old, standing alone in a burned village in 1864. Samuel had been part of a Union column moving through, and they had orders not to stop, not to engage with civilians, just to keep moving. The boy had been crying standing in the ashes of what had probably been his home, and Samuel had looked at him as he rode past. Their eyes had met. The boy had reached out one hand. Samuel had kept riding. Orders were orders. The column had kept moving. He had never known what happened to that boy. He had never gone back. And for 14 years after the war ended, that moment had lived in his chest like a piece of shrapnel too deep to remove. So he had come to Arizona, not to start over, but to disappear, to live in a place so empty and so hard that maybe the emptiness outside would match the emptiness inside, and he would finally stop feeling like a man who had left too many people behind. He got out of bed and dressed in the dark. There was no point trying to sleep again. The dream never came twice in one night, but once was enough. He pulled on his boots, his shirt, his worn leather vest. He walked out onto the porch of his house and looked at the land stretching away in every direction under the stars. The desert was quiet, not the soft quiet of a forest or a meadow, but the hard quiet of a place that did not need to make noise to remind you it was there. The saguaro cacti stood tall and still against the sky, their arms lifted like men in prayer or surrender. The red earth gleamed faintly in the starlight, and far to the north, the dark line of the foothills rose against the horizon. Samuel had learned over the years that the land had its own language. It spoke in the way the wind moved, in the way the light changed from hour to hour, in the way the animals moved or did not move. If you paid attention, if you stayed quiet enough, you could hear it. Not with your ears, but with something deeper. This morning, the land was not saying one, it was waiting. Samuel could feel it. He made coffee on the stove and sat at his small kitchen table as the sun started to rise. The light came slow creeping across the desert floor, turning the red earth to copper and then to gold. He drank his coffee black and thought about the work he had to do. The north fence needed mending. He had been putting it off for 2 weeks, but it could not wait any longer. The water tank had sprung another leak, the fourth one this month, and he still had not figured out where the water was going. He had a colt that had thrown a shoe. He had a list of problems and not enough hours. There were mornings when Samuel thought about giving up, selling the land, moving on, finding someplace else to disappear. But he never did, partly because he was too stubborn, partly because he had nowhere else to go, and partly because he had made this land a kind of promise the same way he had made Rebecca a promise. He would stay, he would work, he would not walk away. By 8 in the morning, the temperature was already climbing toward 95 degrees. Samuel saddled his horse, a gray mare named Alma, and rode out to the east pasture where the fence line ran along a dry wash. He had his tools in a saddlebag: hammer, nails, wire, pliers. The fence posts were old and weathered, and some of them had started to lean. He worked methodically, straightening posts, restringing, wire testing each section to make sure it would hold. The sun pressed down on him like a hand trying to flatten him into the earth. He worked without stopping, the way he always did, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling things he had spent 18 years trying not to feel. It was a little after 9 when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it was a coyote. The sound was faint, carried on the hot wind that moved through the mesquite trees about 100 yards to the north. A high, thin cry that rose and fell and then stopped. He kept working. Coyotes made all kinds of noises, especially in the summer when the pups were young and learning to hunt. But then he heard it again, and something about it was different. It was not the sharp yip of a coyote. It was softer, more human. Samuel stopped working. He set down his hammer and straightened up, wiping the sweat from his face with the back of his hand. He listened. The sound came again, a cry, weak and irregular, like something that had been crying for a long time and was running out of strength. He stood there in the heat, his heart beginning to beat faster, and 1,000 excuses rose up in his mind. It was a coyote. It was the wind moving through a hollow branch. It was his imagination. He was tired. He had not slept well. He was hearing things that were not there. But then another sound came riding underneath the first one. A word. He could not make out what it was, but it was a word. And words did not come from coyotes. Samuel felt something shift inside his chest. It was not a good feeling. It was the feeling of a door opening that he had kept locked for a very long time. He thought about Rebecca. He thought about her hand reaching across the quilt. He thought about the boy in Virginia standing in the ashes reaching out. He thought about the promise he had made and the promises he had broken. And then he started walking toward the mesquite trees. The mesquite grew thick in that part of the property, a tangled wall of twisted branches and thorns that could tear through leather if you were not careful. Samuel pushed through, slowly holding his arms up to protect his face. The thorns caught at his shirt and scraped across his skin, drawing thin lines of blood. The heat was worse here, trapped under the low canopy, heavy and still. He kept walking. The crying sound had stopped, but he did not turn back. He pushed deeper into the mesquite, following some instinct he could not name, until he came out into a small clearing at the base of a large, flat rock. And there she was, a little girl, Apache, maybe 8 years old, though she was so small and thin that she could have been younger. She was sitting with her back against the rock, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face streaked with dust and dried tears. She wore a simple deerskin dress that was torn at the shoulder, and her moccasins were worn nearly through at the soles. Her long black hair was matted and tangled, stuck to her face with sweat and dirt. There was a cut above her left eyebrow, about 3 inches long, and it was still bleeding, though not heavily. Her lips were cracked and white from dehydration. Her arms and legs were covered in scratches and bruises. She looked like she had been out here for a long time. When she saw Samuel, her eyes went wide, not with relief, with fear. She tried to scramble backward, but there was nowhere to go. The rock was behind her. Samuel was in front of her. She was trapped. Samuel stopped immediately. He held up both hands, palms out, and crouched down so he was not towering over her. He did not say anything right away. He just stayed there, crouched in the heat, letting her see that he was not moving, that he was not a threat. The girl stared at him. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Her whole body was shaking. Samuel had seen that look before. In the war. In the eyes of people who had been running for so long that they did not know how to stop. People who had seen too much and lost too much and did not have anything left except the animal need to survive. He stayed very still. He did not reach for her. He did not stand up. He just waited. Slowly, very slowly, the girl's breathing began to slow down. She did not stop shaking, but the wild panic in her eyes dimmed just a little. Samuel reached slowly into the saddlebag he had slung over his shoulder. The girl flinched her eyes, tracking his hand, but he moved carefully, deliberately, so she could see exactly what he was doing. He pulled out his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and held it out toward her. She stared at it, then at him, then at the canteen again. Samuel set it on the ground between them and pushed it forward a few inches with one finger. Then he pulled his hand back and waited. The girl did not move. Her eyes were locked on the canteen. Samuel could see the calculation happening behind those dark eyes. The ancient mathematics of need weighed against fear. She was so thirsty that her lips were bleeding, but she did not know if she could trust him. Thirst won. It always does. She reached out with both hands and grabbed the canteen. She tipped it back and drank like someone who had not had water in days. The water spilled down her chin and onto her dress, but she did not stop drinking until the canteen was nearly empty. Samuel watched her drink and something broke open inside him. He had not cried in 22 years, not since the day they buried Rebecca. But watching this child drink water, watching her hands shake as she held the canteen, he felt tears running down his face. He wiped them away quickly before she could see. When the girl finished drinking, she looked at Samuel and held the canteen out to return it. Samuel shook his head and gestured for her to keep it. She set it carefully in her lap, still watching him. Samuel reached back into the saddlebag and pulled out the hardtack and dried beef he had been planning to eat around noon. He laid them both on the ground and pushed them forward the same way he had pushed the canteen. The girl ate without taking her eyes off him. She ate the way she had drunk, fast and desperate, and the way she ate told Samuel everything he needed to know about how long she had been out here alone. He thought about the nearest Apache camps. They would be up in the foothills to the northwest, maybe 15 miles from here. A child walking alone from there to here in the summer heat was a child who had been walking a long time. When she finished eating, she sat back against the rock and looked at Samuel with those enormous dark eyes. Samuel pointed to himself. Samuel, he said. The girl just looked at him. He pointed to himself again. Samuel. She watched him for a long moment. Then quietly she said a word in Apache. It was soft, almost like a breath. Samuel could not catch it exactly, but he nodded as if he had understood it completely. He did not know what to do next. He could not leave her out here. Not in this heat. Not without knowing whether she could find her way back to wherever she had come from. But he also understood that riding into Apache territory to return a child was an action that carried its own risks. Serious risks. The territorial situation in this part of Arizona was complicated. There had been tensions between the Apache and the white settlers for years. The Apache had been fighting to hold on to their land since before Samuel came west. The government kept pushing them onto reservations, and the Apache kept resisting. Just last month, there had been a raid on a ranch south of Cisco Flats. 2 people had died. Samuel knew that showing up uninvited with an Apache child could easily be misread. He could be seen as a threat. He could be seen as someone who had hurt her. He could be shot before he had a chance to explain. But he also knew that leaving her here was not an option. He thought about it for a long moment, crouched there in the shade of the mesquite with the girl watching him. Then he made his decision, the same way he made most of his decisions. He asked himself what the right thing was, and then he did it, and he would worry about the consequences later. He stood up slowly. The girl tensed, but she did not try to run. Samuel pointed to the north toward the foothills. Then he pointed to himself, then to her, then to the north again. The girl understood. She looked at the direction he was pointing, then back at him. And then to his surprise, she nodded. Samuel held out his hand. The girl looked at it for a long time. Then slowly she reached out and took it. Her hand was so small in his, so light and fragile, like holding a bird. They walked back through the mesquite together. The girl stayed close to him, not quite touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. When they reached the clearing where Alma was tied, Samuel lifted the girl up onto the saddle. She did not resist. She settled into the saddle with a quiet dignity that seemed too old for her years. Samuel climbed up behind her and took the reins. He did not head north toward the foothills. Not yet. He turned Alma south back toward his ranch house. The girl needed the cut above her eyebrow cleaned and bandaged. She needed more water. She needed something more substantial than hardtack in her stomach before he was going to put her on a horse and ride 15 miles in the August heat. They rode in silence. The girl sat very still in front of him, her small hands resting on the saddle horn. Samuel could feel her breathing slow and steady now, not the panicked gasping from before. When they reached the ranch house, Samuel helped her down from the saddle. She stood beside him, looking up at the small wooden structure with curious eyes. He opened the door and gestured for her to go inside. She hesitated, then stepped through the doorway. Inside, Samuel heated water on the stove and found a clean cloth. He gestured for the girl to sit at the kitchen table, and she did. He sat down across from her and showed her the cloth, the bowl of warm water, every movement slow and deliberate, so she could see he was not going to hurt her. When he brought the wet cloth to her forehead, she flinched slightly, but did not pull away. He cleaned the cut, gently wiping away the dried blood and dirt. The cut was not as deep as he had thought. It would heal without stitches, but it needed to be kept clean. He found clean bandages in the cupboard. The fabric was from an old shirt that had belonged to Rebecca. He had kept it all these years, never knowing why. Now he cut strips from it and wrapped them carefully around the girl's head, covering the wound. The girl sat completely still through the whole process, not wincing, not pulling away, just watching his face with that same careful measuring gaze. When he was finished, Samuel made a simple meal, beans and cornbread and a piece of salt pork. He set it in front of the girl without ceremony. She ate it all slowly this time, as if her body was remembering how to eat properly. Samuel sat across from her and drank coffee and did not talk because there was a particular kind of quiet that sometimes meant more than words, and he had learned over the years how to recognize it. After the meal, the girl got up from the table and walked to the window that faced northwest. She stood there looking out at the distant line of the foothills, her hand resting on the windowsill. Samuel understood without needing an explanation. She knew which direction home was. She had probably known the whole time. She had just been too exhausted and too thirsty to make it. He stood and went into his bedroom. He opened the dresser drawer and pulled out the small wooden box. He opened it and looked at the knitted blue sweater inside the one Rebecca had made for their son, who had never been born. He picked it up and held it in his hands. The wool was soft, untouched by time, because it had been kept in the dark for so long. He whispered to her, to the memory that lived in every thread. "Rebecca, I think I finally kept my promise." He put the sweater back in the box and closed the drawer, but this time he did not lock it. When he came back to the kitchen, the girl was still at the window. Samuel gathered supplies for the journey. More water, more food, a blanket in case the temperature dropped in the evening. He was just checking the saddle straps when he heard the sound of hooves. His heart sank. He turned and saw two riders coming across the flat ground toward his fence line. Even from a distance, he recognized them. Jackson Mercer, and riding beside him, Silas Reed. Mercer was 48 years old, a rancher who owned land to the west of Samuel's property. He had lost his younger brother Daniel 3 years ago in a fight with Apache warriors. Since then, Mercer had become one of the loudest voices in Cisco Flats calling for Apache removal. He wanted every Apache in the territory driven out or killed. He did not make distinctions between warriors and families, between men and children. Silas Reed was younger, maybe 35, a hired gun who worked for Mercer. Samuel had seen him in town a few times. He had the look of a man who had killed before and would kill again without much thought. Samuel felt the girl come up beside him. She had seen the riders too. Her hand found his and he felt her small fingers grip tight. Mercer and Reed rode up to the fence and stopped about 20 feet away. Mercer's eyes went straight to the girl and his expression hardened. "Thorne," Mercer said, his voice loud and sharp. "What the hell are you doing with that Apache girl?" Samuel kept his voice calm. "She was lost, hurt. I'm taking her home." Mercer's face went red. "Home? You mean back to the savages who killed my brother?" "She's a child, Mercer, not a warrior." Mercer swung down from his horse and walked toward the fence. Silas stayed mounted, his hand resting casually on the rifle strapped to his saddle. Mercer pointed at the girl. You don't understand, Thorn. Every Apache kid grows up to be a killer. It's in their blood. We should take her to the territorial office. Let them deal with her properly. Samuel knew what the territorial office meant. He had heard the stories. Apache children taken from their families and sent to boarding schools hundreds of miles away. Schools where they were forbidden to speak their language, forbidden to practice their customs, where they were beaten if they resisted. Schools where many of them died of disease or heartbreak, never seeing their families again. I'm not doing that, Samuel said. She goes home to her family. Mercer's jaw tightened. Her family, the same people who killed Daniel, who raid our ranches and steal our cattle. Samuel looked at Mercer steadily. Did she raid your ranch, Jackson? Did she kill your brother? Mercer was silent for a long moment. Then he said no. Then she's innocent, and I won't punish an innocent child for what others did. Silas Reed leaned forward in his saddle. Boss, we can just take the girl. He's one man. Samuel did not look at Silas. He kept his eyes on Mercer. You can try, but you'll have to shoot me first. And you'll have to explain to the whole town why you killed a man for protecting a child. The silence stretched out hot and heavy. Mercer's hand moved toward the pistol on his hip, then stopped. He was angry, but he was not stupid. He knew that killing Samuel over this would turn the town against him. And then something happened that Samuel did not expect. The girl stepped forward. She moved out from behind Samuel and stood directly in front of Mercer. In her hand was a small knife made of chipped stone. Samuel had not even known she had it. She did not raise the knife. She did not threaten. She just stood there, this tiny Apache girl, 8 years old and half-starved, looking up at a grown man twice her size. And in her eyes was something that made even Mercer take a step back. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something older and harder. It was the look of someone who had already survived things that would break most people. Someone who would not be broken by anything else. Mercer stared at her. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not sympathy exactly, but something close to recognition. As if he saw in this child the same thing he had seen in his brother's eyes before Daniel rode off to die. Stubbornness, refusal to bend. Mercer stepped back. He looked at Samuel one more time. You're making a mistake, Thorn. When they come for your ranch, don't expect any help from me or anyone in town. Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. I've been alone for 22 years, Jackson. I think I'll manage. Mercer climbed back onto his horse. He looked down at Samuel and the girl one last time. That girl's family won't see it the way you do, Thorn. To them, you're just another white man. They'll think you hurt her or worse. You're riding into a death trap. Samuel nodded slowly. Maybe, but it's the right thing to do. Mercer spat into the dust and turned his horse. Silas followed. They rode west back toward Mercer's property and did not look back. When they were gone, Samuel knelt down in front of the girl. He held out his hand, and she placed the stone knife in his palm. It was small and sharp, beautifully made, the kind of tool that took skill and patience to create. He looked at her with new respect. You were ready to fight for yourself. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She nodded. Samuel slipped the knife into his vest pocket. I'll keep this safe for you, but you don't need it right now. He stood and helped her back onto the horse. This time when she settled into the saddle, there was something different in the way she held herself. Not trust, not yet, but something close to it. Samuel climbed up behind her and took the reins. He turned Alma north toward the foothills, toward Apache territory, toward whatever was waiting for them there. As they rode, Samuel thought about Mercer's words, about death traps and mistakes. He thought about Rebecca lying in that bed in Pennsylvania asking him to promise. He thought about the boy in Virginia reaching out his hand. He thought about all the times he had walked away when he should have stopped. All the times he had chosen safety over conscience, comfort over courage. And he thought not for the first time that there are worse things than dying. There are worse things than making mistakes. The worst thing is living a life where you never take the risk of doing what is right. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they rode north. The desert stretched out around them in every direction, red rock and pale sand, and the dark green punctuation of saguaro and ocotillo. the kind of landscape that either broke people or became home to them with very little middle ground. The girl pointed once a small adjustment to their direction. Samuel followed without question. She pointed again 20 minutes later, directing them toward a narrow canyon that cut through the foothills. She was navigating, working from landmarks that Samuel could not have named, but that the child moved toward with the certainty of someone reading a map only she could see. It occurred to Samuel not for the first time how much knowledge was stored in the people who had lived in this landscape for generations. Knowledge about water and weather and the way light moved across rock at different hours. Knowledge that men like him arrived with none of and spent lifetimes trying to partially reconstruct. They had been riding for nearly 2 hours when Samuel noticed the change. It was a stillness in the landscape that was different from the ordinary stillness of the desert. A quality of attention in the air around them, as if the rocks themselves had begun to watch. He had been in the territory long enough to know what that meant. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not speed up or slow down. He kept his hands visible on the reins and rode at the same easy pace and waited. The Apache warriors appeared on the ridge to his left, then another on the right, then 3 more directly ahead sitting motionless on their horses against the skyline. Samuel counted 6 before he stopped counting. There could have been more. Probably were. He pulled the horse to a gentle stop and sat still. The girl in front of him had gone rigid, but she had not made a sound. Then she called out. Her voice carried surprisingly well in the dry air, a single phrase that Samuel could not parse, but that clearly meant something to the warriors on the ridge. There was a pause, a long one, Tiron. Samuel could feel his heart beating hard in his chest, could feel the sweat running down his back under his shirt. Then the warrior directly ahead of them began to ride down toward them slowly. The others followed. The man who stopped his horse 10 feet from Samuel was broad and powerfully built, maybe 35 years old. He wore a cotton shirt and leather leggings, his dark hair loose around his shoulders. He looked at the girl, first a rapid and thorough assessment that took in every detail. The bandage around her head, the way she was sitting, the fact that she was unharmed. Then he looked at Samuel. His expression was unreadable in the way that a man's expression becomes unreadable when he has spent years of his life never knowing what the next moment would bring. The girl spoke to him at length, her voice quick and urgent, pointing once at Samuel, once at the bandage on her forehead, once back in the direction they had come from. The warrior listened without moving. When the child finished, he looked at Samuel again, and this time there was something different in the look. Not warmth, not yet, but a different quality of attention. Samuel held up his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in the same gesture he had used with the girl that morning. Open, nothing in them, no threat. He nodded at the warrior, then at the girl. The message was simple and complete. Here, she is safe. I am returning her. The warrior reached out and the girl climbed easily from Samuel's saddle to his settling in front of the man with a naturalness that told Samuel this was someone she knew well. Her father, Samuel guessed. Or an uncle. The warrior held Samuel's gaze for a long moment. Samuel did not look away, did not try to smile or placate, just held the look steady and honest. Then one of the other warriors spoke, an older man maybe in his 60s with white threading through his hair. He rode forward and stopped beside the younger warrior. When he spoke, it was in English. Slow and careful English that clearly cost him some effort. The girl is Nalin. This is Marcus Wolfhart, her father. She was tracking a deer 3 days ago and became lost in the canyon system. When she did not return, many men searched. They found her trail leading this way toward the flatlands, but they did not find her. He paused, looking at Samuel with sharp, assessing eyes. Nalin told her father what you did, that you gave her water and food, that you cleaned her wound and fed her and brought her home. Marcus wants to know why. Samuel thought about how to answer that. Finally, he said, she was thirsty and hungry and hurt. I did what anybody should do. The old man translated. Marcus listened, then said something brief. The old man translated that too. Marcus says that is not true. Not everybody would do it. There was a particular kind of silence that settles in the desert when something important has just been said, and both parties know it, and neither wants to rush past it. Samuel sat in that silence and let it be what it was. Then Marcus reached into the leather bag at his hip and pulled something out. He held it forward. It was a cord of woven leather dyed red and black in a repeating pattern with a small piece of turquoise tied at the center. Samuel looked at it, then at the old man for guidance. The old man said, "He wants you to take it. It means you are known to us. It means if you are ever in a bad place and one of our people finds you, they will know you are someone who has done right." Samuel reached up and took the cord from Marcus's hand. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. It was not much in his palm, just leather and stone. But it was more than that, too. "Thank you," Samuel said. Marcus nodded once, then he said something else longer this time. The old man translated. "He says also that there is a spring 3 miles east of where you are building your north fence. The ground there looks dry, but it is not. If you dig down 4 feet at the base of the second red rock formation, you will find what you need. He says you have been hauling water from too far and working too hard for it." Samuel stared at him. "How long has he known about that spring?" The old man translated. Marcus answered. The old man translated back. "Long time. His grandfather's grandfather knew that spring. He says the ground out here holds more than it shows. Sometimes it takes someone from the outside to need it before someone from the inside thinks to mention it." It took Samuel a moment to find words. When he did, his voice was rough. "Please tell him that is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 20 years of living on this land." When the translation came back, Marcus's face moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was close enough. He said one more thing before he turned his horse. The old man translated. "He says take care of the spring when you find it. Clean water does not owe anybody anything. It just keeps giving to whoever is careful with it." Then Marcus looked at Nalan and said something short. The girl looked at Samuel with those serious dark eyes and raised her hand palm flat in something that was unmistakably a farewell. Samuel raised his own hand back. Then they rode north, all 6 of them, and disappeared into the shimmer of the afternoon heat. Samuel sat alone on his horse for a long time after they were gone. He turned the leather cord over in his hand, looking at the turquoise at its center, the way it caught the light, and held it for a second before letting it go. He thought about the spring. He thought about how many mornings he had hauled water from the creek 2 miles south, how many hours he had spent worrying about the tank leaking and the dry season coming. He thought about the girl eating beans at his kitchen table, watching him with those careful eyes. And he thought about how small a thing it had been to help her. Some water, some food, a bandage on a cut, and a ride home. He thought about how the world had a way of making the smallest things carry the heaviest weight. He put the leather cord around his neck, tucking it inside his shirt so it rested against his chest. Then he turned his horse south and started the long ride back to the ranch. As he rode, Samuel Thorne thought about promises, about the ones you keep and the ones you break, about the ones that cost you nothing and the ones that cost you everything. He thought about Rebecca and about the boy in Virginia and about all the moments in his life when he had walked away instead of stopping. And he thought that maybe, just maybe, he had finally taken a step toward making some of those moments right. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when he reached his property. He did not go to the house. He rode east along the north fence line, counting the red rock formations as they rose out of the earth one by one. The second one was a broad, flat-topped outcrop that caught the late sun and turned copper at the edges. Samuel dismounted and knelt at its base. He pressed his hand into the ground. The earth there was different from the ground around it, darker, with a faint give to it that was unlike the hard-packed soil of the surrounding desert. He went back to the horse and got his short-handled shovel from the pack saddle. He walked back to the rock and began to dig. The first foot was hard and dry and unremarkable. The second foot was the same. At the start of the third foot, the dirt changed color, going from pale red to a deep rust brown. The shovel moved through it differently with less resistance, as if something below were pulling it down. At 3.5 feet, the bottom of the hole was damp. At 4 feet, water began to seep in from the sides, slow and clear and cold in a way that should not have been possible in August in the Sonoran Desert. Samuel knelt over the hole for a long time, watching the water come. He pressed his fingers into it and brought them to his lips, cold and clean and faintly sweet. The way only spring water is sweet, with a taste that has nothing to do with sugar and everything to do with the particular mineral patience of water that has been traveling through rock for longer than any of us have been alive. He sat back on his heels in the dust and looked out at the desert around him, the long, flat stretches of sin and rock and scrub, and he thought that this was a thing about land that most people never learn. It kept its best things hidden, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. It made you earn them, and it almost never gave them to you the way you expected. Samuel Thorne had come to this piece of ground 18 years ago, looking for a place to disappear. He had found that more or less, but he had also found something else, something that did not have a precise name in the English he had grown up speaking. That feeling of being known by a piece of ground, of having stayed long enough and worked honestly enough and kept faith enough with a difficult place that eventually the place acknowledged you back. He stayed by the spring until the sun set and the stars began to appear. Then he rode back to his house in the dark, carrying with him the knowledge that tomorrow he would begin building a proper stone surround for the spring, that he would mortar the rocks carefully to keep the mouth of it clean, that he would build a wooden cover to keep debris out and a small trough on the downhill side where the overflow could run. And he carried with him something else too, something harder to name but easier to feel. The sense that he had finally, after 22 years of trying, kept a promise that mattered. That night, Samuel Thorne slept without dreaming for the first time in longer than he could remember. Samuel woke the next morning to silence. Not the heavy silence of guilt that had haunted him for 2 decades, but a different kind. The silence of work waiting to be done. The silence of purpose. He made coffee as the sun rose and thought about the spring. 3 miles east, 4 feet down. Water that had been there all along, just waiting for someone to know where to look. By the time he finished his coffee, he had made a list in his mind. He would need stones from the dry wash, mortar which he could mix from lime and sand, wood for the cover, tools he already had. What he did not have was time, but time was something you made when the work mattered. He spent that first day gathering stones, large flat ones that would stack well and hold their shape. He loaded them into a wooden cart hitched to Alma and hauled them back to the spring site one load at a time. The work was hard and hot, and by the end of the day his back ached and his hands were raw, but there was something good in the ache. Something that felt like building instead of just enduring. On the second day, he began laying the stones. He worked slowly, fitting each one carefully against the next, making sure the walls would be strong enough to last. The spring continued to seep up from the bottom of the hole, filling it gradually, and Samuel had to bail it out twice to keep working. But each time he bailed it, the water came back. Patient, persistent. By the third day, the stone surround was waist high, and the water inside was clear and cold. Samuel built a wooden frame for the cover, fitting the planks together with the same careful attention he had given to the stones. When he was finished, the spring looked like something that had always been there, something permanent. He tested it that evening, lowering a bucket on a rope and pulling up water so cold it made his teeth ache. He drank it straight from the bucket, and it tasted like the best thing he had ever put in his mouth. That night, he sat on his porch and looked north toward the foothills. Somewhere up there, Nayland was home with her family. Marcus Wolfhart knew where this spring was, had always known, could have kept that knowledge to himself the way people keep valuable things from strangers. But he had shared it instead. Samuel touched the leather cord around his neck, feeling the turquoise stone through his shirt. He thought about gifts and debts and the strange arithmetic of kindness that did not follow any rules he had been taught. The spring changed things. Within a week, Samuel had run a pipe from it to a trough in the north pasture, and his cattle no longer had to walk 2 miles for water. They stayed closer to home, fattened up faster, looked healthier. The grass in that pasture, fed by the overflow from the trough, turned greener than it had been in years. Samuel did not talk about the spring in town. He did not mention how he had found it. When he went to Cisco Flats for supplies, he kept his head down and his conversations brief. But people noticed anyway. They noticed that his cattle looked good while theirs were starting to show ribs. They noticed that he was not hauling water from the creek anymore. Clayton Webb noticed first. Webb was Samuel's neighbor to the south, a rancher about Samuel's age who had been working his land for almost as long. He was a quiet man, practical, not given to asking questions that were not his business. But one afternoon in late August, he rode over to Samuel's property and asked straight out, "Thorne, how are you getting water? The creek's down to nothing, and I saw your cattle at the north pasture looking fat and happy." Samuel considered lying, considered saying he had just been lucky with the tank or that he had found a way to collect more rainwater. But Webb had always been fair with him, never joined Mercer's angry speeches in town, never looked at Samuel like he was strange for keeping to himself. So Samuel told him the truth, or part of it anyway. "There's a spring on my east property. Didn't know it was there until recently. Webb's eyebrows went up. A spring out here. Come on, I'll show you. They rode to the spring together and Samuel showed him the stone surround the clear water running into the trough. Webb stared at it the way a man stares at something that should not exist, but clearly does. How'd you find it? Webb asked. Samuel thought about how to answer. Finally, he said, someone who knew this land better than I do told me where to look. Webb turned to look at him. Who? Does it matter? Webb was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. No, I suppose it doesn't. Samuel gestured to the trough. You're welcome to bring your cattle over in the evenings if you need to. There's enough. Webb took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. He was not a man who accepted help easily, Samuel knew. Pride ran deep in men who worked hard land. I appreciate that, Thorn. Come fall when I slaughter, you will get half a side of beef. That's not necessary. I know it's not, but I'll do it anyway. They stood there together in the heat, two men who barely knew each other, bound together by the simple fact of water in a dry land. After Webb left, Samuel thought about the conversation, about how Webb had not pressed him on who had told him about the spring, about how some questions were better left unasked. But not everyone in Cisco Flats was as tactful as Clayton Webb. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. By September, 3 more ranchers had heard about Samuel's spring and his cattle that looked too good for a drought year. 2 of them came asking for help. A man named Henry Dalton and a widow named Ruth Ashford, who was trying to keep her late husband's ranch running with 2 teenage sons and not much money. Samuel let them both use the water. He asked nothing in return except that they keep the trough clean and not waste what they took. Both of them agreed. Both of them came back later with gifts. Dalton brought a wheel of cheese his wife had made. Ruth Ashford brought jars of preserves and a loaf of bread still warm from her oven. Samuel accepted the gifts because refusing would have been an insult. But what he valued more than the food was the way they looked at him when they came to collect water. Not with suspicion or distance, but with something approaching respect. It was a small thing being respected. Samuel had not realized how much he had missed it, but not everyone felt the same way. One night in early October, Samuel went out to check the spring before bed. It was something he did every evening now, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. Make sure the cover was secure. Make sure no debris had gotten into the water. Make sure the trough was not clogged. He carried a lantern, and as he approached the spring, the light caught on something that should not have been there. A figure standing beside the stone surround, looking down into the water. Samuel stopped. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he had learned to carry at night, but he did not draw it. Not yet. Who's there? He called. The figure turned. The lantern light fell across a face Samuel recognized immediately. Jackson Mercer. Mercer did not look guilty or surprised. He just stood there with his arms crossed, looking at Samuel with an expression that was hard to read in the shadows. Nice spring you've got here, Thorn, Mercer said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath the calm that Samuel did not like. What are you doing on my property, Mercer? Just curious. Heard you'd found water. Wanted to see it for myself. Mercer looked down at the spring again. Funny thing, water appearing where there wasn't any before. Makes a man wonder. Samuel set the lantern down on a rock and kept his hand near the rifle. Wonder about what? About how you found it. About who told you it was here. Mercer looked up, and now his face was clearer in the light. There was no warmth in it. You've been helping those Apache, haven't you? That's how you knew. I found a lost child and took her home. That's all. That's all. Mercer's voice rose slightly. You took an Apache girl onto your property, fed her, cared for her, rode into their territory alone, and you expect me to believe they didn't give you something in return. Samuel kept his voice level. They told me where to find water. Yes, as thanks for bringing their daughter home safely. That's not a crime, Mercer. No. Mercer took a step closer. While you're sharing water with the same people who killed my brother, while you're taking their advice and their gifts, the rest of us are trying to survive. You know what people in town are saying? They're saying you've gone native, that you're a traitor to your own kind. My own kind. Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sudden. My kind is people who don't let children die in the desert. My kind is people who honor a debt when someone does them a favor. If that makes me a traitor, then I guess I'm a traitor. Mercer's hand moved toward his belt, and Samuel's hand tightened on the rifle. For a long moment, they stood facing each other in the lamplight, and the night around them seemed to hold its breath. Then Mercer's hand moved away from his belt. He shook his head slowly. You're a fool, Thorne. You think because you helped one girl, they're going to protect you? You think that makes you special. He turned to leave, then looked back over his shoulder. When this drought gets worse, when people start getting desperate, they're going to remember who's sharing water with the enemy, and they're going to remember who chose sides. He walked away into the darkness. Samuel heard his horse herd him right off west toward his own property. Samuel stood by the spring for a long time after Mercer left. His hands were shaking, and he realized it was not just anger. It was fear. Not fear of Mercer exactly, but fear of what Mercer represented. The town turning against him, being cut off from the only community he had, small as it was. But then he thought about Nalin's eyes looking up at him from beneath that mesquite tree. He thought about the weight of her hand in his when she had taken the water. He thought about Marcus Wolfhart sharing knowledge that had been in his family for generations. And he thought that if choosing to help a child made him an enemy to people like Mercer, then he would rather be an enemy. The drought that had started in spring continued into fall. The creek that ran south of most of the ranches in the area, the one Samuel used to haul water from, dried up completely by November. Families who had been holding on started to leave. 3 more ranches went abandoned, their owners packing what they could carry and heading back east or north to Colorado, where they had heard the grass was still green. The ones who stayed grew harder, leaner, more desperate. Samuel's cattle stayed healthy. His spring kept running clear and cold and seemingly endless. He shared it with Webb, with Dalton, with Ruth Ashford, but he did not advertise it. He did not offer it to the town. He knew that would only make things worse. In late November, something else started happening. Small things at first, so small that Samuel almost missed them. He went to check the spring one morning and found a bundle on the flat rock beside the wooden cover. Dried meat cut into thin strips and wrapped in a broad leaf tied with a piece of the same red and black woven leather as the cord he wore around his neck. There were no footprints that he could find. No sign of anyone having been there. Just the meat on the rock and the spring running clean and cold below it. Samuel picked up the bundle and unwrapped it. The meat was venison, seasoned with something he could not identify, but that tasted like dried juniper and smoke. He ate a piece standing there in the morning light. It was good. Better than good. He left the leaf and the cord on the rock. It seemed like the right thing to do. 3 weeks later, there was another gift. A bundle of dried herbs tied with thin rope sitting in exactly the same spot. Samuel did not know what the herbs were, but when Thomas Greyhawk came through town a few days later, Samuel described them to him. Thomas smiled. Brew them into tea. Good for joint pain. Good for the cold that's coming. Did you leave them there? Samuel asked. Thomas's smile widened slightly. Not me, but I know who did. Samuel did not ask who. He did not need to. A month after that, there was a third gift. A small carving no bigger than his palm of a deer in mid-leap. It was made from pale yellow stone, and the detail was extraordinary. Every muscle defined every line of the body, precise and graceful. Samuel took it back to his house and put it on the windowsill above his kitchen sink where the morning light could find it. Every time he washed his hands or filled a pot with water, he saw it. A reminder of something he could not quite name, but felt deeply nonetheless. The gifts kept coming through the winter, never predictable, never announced. Samuel would go to check the spring and find something waiting. Herbs, carved stones. Once a small bag of seeds that Thomas later told him would grow into a kind of squash that did well in dry soil. Samuel never saw who left them. He never asked. He simply received them the way they were given, quietly and without ceremony. And in return, he took care of the spring with the same careful attention he had given it from the beginning. He kept the water clean. He repaired the wooden cover when it started to warp in the heat. He made sure the trough did not get clogged with debris. And slowly, without ever speaking of it directly, an understanding grew between him and the people who left the gifts. They were watching over him the way he was watching over the spring, not intrusively, not demandingly, just present, just there. It was a strange thing being watched over. Samuel had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone notice whether you were all right or not, to have someone care enough to leave small kindnesses on a rock beside a spring in the middle of nowhere. Winter came cold and hard that year. Snow fell in the foothills and ice formed on the edges of the trough at night. But the spring kept running. Samuel had to break ice some mornings, but underneath the water was still flowing, still cold and clear and sweet. In January, on a morning so cold that frost covered everything white, Samuel went to check the spring and found something different waiting for him. Not food, not herbs, not a carving. It was a blanket, woven from wool dyed in patterns of red and black and white, thick and warm and beautiful. Samuel picked it up and held it in his hands. It was heavy, the kind of weight that came from quality, from hours of work, from someone who knew how to make things that would last. He wrapped it around his shoulders and stood there by the spring as the sun came up, and he thought about the strange path his life had taken, how he had come to this empty place to disappear, and how instead he had been found. Not by people who looked like him, or talked like him, or lived like him, but found nonetheless. He thought about Rebecca and the promise he had made, about how keeping that one promise had opened something he had thought was closed forever, a door to a kind of life he had not known was possible, a life where you could be alone without being lonely, where you could be quiet without being forgotten, where kindness given came back in forms you did not expect, but valued all the more for their strangeness. Samuel wore the blanket back to his house and laid it across his bed. That night he slept under it, and it was the warmest he had been in years. Spring came slowly to the desert. The snow in the foothills melted, and the runoff made the dry washes flow for a few weeks before they dried up again. But the drought did not break. If anything, it got worse. By March, the creek that had dried up the previous fall still had not come back. Ranchers who had made it through the winter started talking about leaving come summer if things did not improve. The tension in Cisco Flats grew thicker, meaner. Men drank more in the saloon and talked louder about whose fault it was that the land was dying. Samuel stayed away from town as much as he could. When he had to go for supplies, he went early in the morning and left before the afternoon crowd gathered. He did not want trouble, and he knew that trouble was looking for him. It found him anyway. In late April, Samuel was mending fence on his western boundary when he saw the riders coming. 4 of them moving at a deliberate pace across the flat ground. Even from a distance, he recognized the lead rider, Jackson Mercer. Samuel set down his tools and waited. Running would have been pointless. Fighting would have been stupid, so he just stood there and let them come. Mercer pulled up about 10 feet away. The 3 men with him spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle. Samuel recognized one of them as Silas Reed. The other 2 were younger, harder looking. Men who had come west looking for something and had not found it and were angry about it. "Thorne," Mercer said. His voice was flat businesslike. "We need to talk." "So talk." "Cattle have been disappearing. Mine Dalton's Reed's over in the east section, 12 head in the last month." Samuel said nothing. He knew where this was going. "Now I know you've been friendly with the Apache, real friendly. So I'm going to ask you straight. Are they taking our cattle?" Samuel kept his voice calm. "I don't know, Mercer. Are they? Don't play games with me. You've been helping them. They've been helping you. That spring of yours, those gifts you've been getting. You think we don't know?" Samuel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Who told you about gifts?" One of the younger men, a ranch hand named Cole, spoke up. "I seen him. Was riding past your property at dawn 2 weeks back and saw you picking something up off a rock by that spring. Looked like Indian work to me." Samuel looked at Cole, then back at Mercer. "So what if it was, someone leaves me a gift, I'm supposed to refuse it? You're supposed to know whose side you're on," Mercer said. His voice was getting louder now, angrier. "We're trying to build something here, Thorne. A community, a place where white families can live and work and raise their children. And you're undermining that by collaborating with savages who steal our cattle and kill our people. Have you seen them steal cattle? Do you have any proof?" "I don't need proof. I know how they operate. They wait until we're weak, until the drought has us desperate, and then they take what they want." Samuel shook his head. "You're guessing, Mercer. You lost your brother, and I'm sorry for that. But you can't blame every Apache for what happened to Daniel. And you can't blame them for every bad thing that happens." Mercer's face went red. "My brother died because of them. And you're going to stand there and defend them?" "I'm not defending anyone. I'm saying you don't know who took your cattle. Could be anyone, could be rustlers from Mexico, could be someone from another ranch, could be your own hired hands selling them on the side. That was a mistake. Samuel saw it the moment the words left his mouth. Silas Reed's hand moved to his gun, and suddenly all four men were tense ready. You calling us thieves, Thorne? Reed's voice was cold. Samuel kept his hands visible away from his own gun. I'm saying you're jumping to conclusions. And conclusions like that get people killed. Mercer stared at Samuel for a long moment. Then he said, we're going up into Apache territory tomorrow, going to find our cattle and bring them back. And if we find any Apache warriors along the way, we're going to make sure they understand that stealing from us has consequences. Samuel's blood went cold. That's a mistake, Mercer. A bad one. The only mistake was trusting that they'd leave us alone if we left them alone. That time's over. Mercer turned his horse. You're either with us or you're against us, Thorne. There's no middle ground anymore. Then I'm against you. Mercer looked back surprised. What? If you ride into Apache territory looking for a fight, you're going to find one. And a lot of people are going to die. So yes, I'm against you. Mercer's expression hardened. Then you're a traitor. And when we get back, everyone in Cisco Flats is going to know it. The four men rode off west, and Samuel stood watching them go. His hands were shaking again, but this time it was not just fear. It was rage and helplessness and the terrible knowledge that something very bad was about to happen, and he could not stop it. He thought about riding after them, trying to talk sense into Mercer. But he knew it would not work. Mercer had lost his brother, and he needed someone to blame. They needed someone to hurt, and nothing Samuel said was going to change that. Then he thought about Marcus Wolfhart, about Nolan, about the people who had shared their knowledge and left gifts by his spring. They needed to know that Mercer was coming. They needed to be ready. Samuel made his decision in less than a minute. He went back to his house, saddled Alma, and started riding north toward the foothills. He had no idea if he would be welcome, no idea if the leather cord around his neck would be enough to keep him from getting shot. But he knew he had to try. Because that was the thing about promises and debts and the strange arithmetic of kindness. Once you started down that road, once you chose to see people as people instead of as enemies, you could not just turn around when things got difficult. You had to see it through, no matter what it cost you. Samuel rode hard, pushing Alma faster than he should have in the heat. The sun climbed higher, and the desert stretched out around him vast and indifferent. He followed the same route he had taken months ago, when he had brought Nolan home, navigating by landmarks he half remembered, an instinct he hoped would be enough. He was 2 hours into the ride when he saw them. 3 riders on a ridge to his east, then 2 more to the west, then more appearing from behind rocks and out of draws, materializing the way Apache warriors always seemed to materialize, as if the land itself was creating them. Samuel did not stop. He did not reach for his rifle. He just kept riding at the same steady pace, his hands visible on the reins, the leather cord around his neck clearly displayed outside his shirt. One of the riders came down from the ridge to intercept him. Samuel recognized him. It was Marcus Wolfhart. They met in a dry wash. Marcus's horse stopped 10 feet from Samuel's. The warrior's face was unreadable, but his hand rested on the rifle across his saddle. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel said, I need to talk to you. It's important. Marcus stared at him. Then he made a gesture, and suddenly Thomas Greyhawk was there, riding up from behind a rock formation, as if he had been there the whole time. Why have you come? Thomas asked. Samuel took a breath. Mercer and 3 others are planning to ride into your territory tomorrow. They think you've been stealing cattle. They're coming looking for trouble. Thomas translated. Marcus listened, his expression unchanged. When Thomas finished, Marcus said something brief. Thomas translated. He says we have not taken any cattle. We do not need to steal. The deer are plentiful this season. I believe you, Samuel said, but Mercer doesn't, and he's angry enough and scared enough to start a fight. If you're not ready, people are going today. Your people. Maybe his. Maybe both. Thomas translated again. This time Marcus's expression changed slightly, not to fear but to something harder. Colder. He said something longer, his voice tight. Thomas translated. Marcus says his people have been watching Mercer's ranch. There are strangers there, men from the south who come at night and take cattle. Not Apache, Mexican rustlers, maybe, or outlaws. But Mercer will not see that. He only sees what he wants to see. Samuel nodded slowly. So what are you going to do? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke again. Thomas said, Marcus asks, what are you going to do? Samuel had not expected that question. He thought about it. Thought about going back to his ranch, staying out of it, letting Mercer and Marcus work it out between themselves. But that would mean more deaths, more widows, more children without fathers. I'm going to try to stop them, Samuel said. Both sides, if I have to. Thomas translated. When Marcus heard it, something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but something close to approval. He said one sentence, Thomas translated. He says, then you are braver than you look. Marcus turned his horse and gestured for Samuel to follow. They rode together into the foothills, surrounded by warriors who moved silently through the rocks and brush, and Samuel thought that he was either about to save lives or about to get himself killed, possibly both. They rode deeper into the foothills, into country Samuel had never seen. The land changed as they climbed the flat desert, giving way to broken terrain, rocky draws and narrow canyons where the shadows stayed cool even in the heat of the day. The saguaro and ocotillo thinned out, replaced by juniper and pinyon pine that clung to the slopes like they were holding on against the wind. Marcus led the way with the certainty of someone who had walked this ground since childhood. The other warriors moved around them like water flowing around stones, visible one moment and gone the next, their horses picking paths through terrain that looked impassable. Samuel tried to keep track of where they were going, tried to memorize landmarks in case he needed to find his way back alone. But after an hour, he gave up. This was their country. He was only here because